This is part 2 of a reply to Inmendham's Biology 103 video. I'll put a link below to it. Yeah, so this was the comment that Gary responded to, which I guess defended, so this was this was the starting point of it, but really the only bit that I was defending was I don't know if you can read this, so I'll read the whole thing and then I'll explain the bit that I was trying to defend. So Conferencereport said the selfish gene adds no weight at all to the argument. If anything, it's an argument against antinatalism, because it stresses the different interests that exist at the level of the gene and the level of the organism. Genes, or the DNA, can be a total bastard, but the organisms they exist within could be angels, in brackets, unlikely but no less possible than they being monsters. Now I wouldn't wish to defend the whole thing, but the only thing I was really picking up on was that that the selfish gene, as in the book, is really like one long argument about this stressing the different interests that exists at the level of the gene and the level of the organism thing, that there are these and that the argument in the book was that we should really we get a lot further in understanding many of the sort of phenomena that we see in nature if we consider the gene point of view. So anyway, I'll get on to Gary's comment.
In the big picture. Well, anyways, let's get to the selfish gene shit. This is where it goes way the fuck off first. Conferencereport is quite right that the interests are not necessarily the same at different levels. Well, no, look, they're not different levels. Alright? If a fucking queen ant creates a bunch of slaves, obviously the non-reproducing slaves are not part of the genetic code. Alright? So they obviously have nothing to do with any of this shit, right? They don't have any...
The genetic code that produces the queens also produces the various castes of workers.
Nothing to do with anything epigenetic, and they certainly don't have anything to do with the selfish gene anymore. They're just disposable slaves. They are...
The worker ants have more genes in common with her mother's offspring than the mother herself does. The worker has fewer genes in common with her own offspring than the offspring of the queen. So from a selfish gene point of view, who's getting the raw deal here? By helping her mother produce sisters that share 75% of their genes, you know, the worker is getting a better deal than the queen herself. So you know, if we were to take like a random chromosome, so, and this is the genotype of the queen, and this is the genotype of the male, who's only got one set of chromosomes, and these are the chromosomes of the male, which are all the same, and these are the a sample of the gametes of the queen. The upshot is that the female offspring of this mating, if there's just a single mating, the sisters the female offspring, the sisters will unusually share 75% of their genes with each other, because they've got the male chromosomes in common, so they're identical, and then they'll share 50% of the genes that they acquired from their mother. So these females, they share 75% of their genes, and the queen shares her relationship with these things is only 50%. So it makes perfect sense. So whereas the worker, if she were to reproduce herself, she'd only be related 50% to her own female offspring. So it makes perfect sense for the worker to invest in the mother's offspring. Now when it comes to males, it's a different story, and because the females are only going to be 25% related to their mother's offspring, and this sort of sets up a prediction that the worker here is going to want to invest far more in her sisters than in her brothers, at a ratio of, so if the work, in terms of the sex ratio that the workers want, the workers will want a ratio of something like 3 to 1 in favour of females, whereas the queen, she's going to want a 1 to 1 ratio. And lo and behold, in situations in ant species that have just this simple single mating arrangement, it's often the worker arrangement that trumps the queen's arrangement. I mean, it can be very complicated in different systems, but you know, clearly in certain circumstances, you know, the workers have managed to come up trumps on this tug of war.
They are not part of the genetic. They could have all kinds of mutations, they could be doing all kinds of interesting evolution, and it's going to be completely irrelevant because they are irrelevant to the genetic code. Period. 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 They're slaves. That's all they are. Okay, so so that works for
yeah, slaves. Well, I guess they are slaves, but the slave driver, if you like, is their own DNA. You're right that any mutations that are specific to that worker will be lost, but we can assume that you know, mutations specific to these individuals is going to be they're going to constitute a very tiny proportion of the genes. However, you know, any genes, including any mutations that occurred in the common ancestor of these individuals will have been inherited by both the workers and the reproductives. So while a gene that says, you know, if you find yourself in a worker, forego your reproduction in favour of nurturing your mother's offspring, will not produce any new copies of itself directly, the chances are, well, in fact the chances are better, particularly with our sisters, that by nurturing a sister, it will increase the chances of getting copies of itself into the future.
That works for insects because they have so many, they can produce a new copy so easily that they can afford to create slaves. So it seems a perfectly reasonable mechanism. You know, if you can create millions of offspring, then you might as well create the millions of offspring to create a shield around you, so you don't get...
Yeah, I can see how that might seem reasonable. Certainly there are circumstances where group selection arguments might apply. But in this case, you don't really need to go to the group, you know, as the unit of selection, or rather, the gene as unit of selection offers a more parsimonious solution to the problem.
Killed. And that's all that's happening. The queen is just creating slaves to create a shield around her, and she's the animal that's actually evolving. They are not evolving at all. She's evolving. So there's nothing, there's no level here, okay? The slave organisms...
Well, they quite obviously do evolve, or rather the genes that express themselves only in workers evolve. You only need to, compare workers from different species, to see that, they are evolving.
They shouldn't even be called ants, okay? Because they're not really ants. They're slaves. And drone bees are slaves, all right? That's all they are. They're slaves to the queen's DNA, period. They're not in the game. They're fucking sperm cells with swords. They're not...
They're not in the game directly, in the sense that they don't have any direct descendants, in the same way that, your liver doesn't have any direct descendants, your liver's not in the game. Your liver will not contribute directly to livers of the future. It will, however, exert an influence on the survival of, the liver makers.
Playing the evolutionary game. Anyway, the selfish gene, the book that is in fact one long argument explaining this, mainly to sociobiologists who at the time were advocating group selection to explain certain adaptations. Well, group selection is in effect in the sense that when you get to the higher mammals, obviously mammals can't create an army of slaves. So instead, it goes with a mechanism of hierarchy. So there's one individual that's given the adaptations are turned on, the improvements. So one individual gets the Wi-Fi, gets the the infrared scanner, gets the blah blah camera, gets all the new features, and all the others are left with the old.
Well, this is exactly the kind of thinking that Dawkins was arguing against.
Features. They're just left to be kind of sacrificial, all right, to the alpha. And that's sort of where the investment is. So their investment is in the survival of their society, in the sense that the structure survives. The structure of having a group survives. And they become incidental in the sense that they don't have any genetic stake in the game, and they're basically...
So, so the question arises then, how in that situation, how can that situation be evolutionarily stable if the subordinates have no stake? Then presumably, in a very few number of generations, everyone is going to have the Wi-Fi.
They just slaves again. It's just like having one kid that's going to be the main kid. Let's say you have 6 kids. One kid's going to be the main kid, and the other 5 kids are essentially going to create a shield for that one kid. That's going to have the recessive dream. I mean, it's going to have the dominant. It's going to have the dominant, the improved genes turned on instead of the unimproved.
So how do you explain the existence of these unimproved kids? What maintains them in the population?
This is one way of looking at it. For instance, self-sacrifice for the colony is not in the welfare or interest of the worker ant, but is certainly, if mom behaves herself, in the interest of her genes. Well, again, her genes are the only genes in the game. There are no worker.
I think you misread that bit. The her in the sentence refers to the worker, not the queen. So I'm talking about her genes as in the worker's genes.
Ant genes. The worker ants carry the mother's genes, and that's all there is. There is no other genetic code taking place. Period. Period. But we're not ants, and there's a similar mechanism created in mammals that where a hierarchy, the dominant alpha syndrome. Attempts to duplicate the mechanism, but
in social organisms, I mean, the best strategy in any situation is going to depend heavily on what others are doing. If you were a beta in your alpha example, or where there's some kind of pecking order, it's not necessarily going to be in your best interests to fight the alpha. You might just be helping your other beta rivals in doing so. I mean, fighting has its costs, as well as its benefits. You might be better off waiting for another beta to weaken the alpha, in themselves before attempting a takeover, for instance.
Obviously, it can't do it to the same grotesque extent, but it's still doing this idea of investing in a narrow set of genetic code and having disposables. And I would argue that probably.
Again, you'd have to be able to explain the existence of these disposables.
Does slow down evolution, and you can you might get an indication of that in the sense that many organisms that have dramatic alpha effects, physical effects related to their alpha morphing, like orangutans and elephant seals and some other organisms, even I think polar bears do some of this. They're animals that didn't exactly take over the world. They're not exactly spread everywhere, where animals like, I don't know if there's much in wilderness.
Well, I don't know. I mean, but if the ants are at all analogous, then they constitute about half the biomass in the tropics. So I don't know whether that's a significant factor or not.
Or beast or buffalo. I don't know if they have much of an alpha manifestation. Are seen more successful in the sense that they're going to be more durable because they're more widespread. So it does seem like there might be it might suppress your evolution. It might slow it down if you resort to this feature, because you're essentially saying we're going to cut off, 5 out of 6 of the genetic variation. We're going to kind of cut off from the breeding pool. And so it probably does slow down evolution. But most evolution, I'm going to argue, isn't taking place in those big colonies. It's taking place in isolated, go west, young man type colonies. The inbreds are the ones that create the evolution. Galapagos Island is a perfect example.
I don't know. I guess that's a different subject. Though presumably your argument relies on small effective population size, which I guess would be a characteristic of your model of alpha societies.
So, yeah, so anyway, I just find this statement wrong, and I find this statement irritating, where you say is quite right, because that's really dangerous, because in his statement he talked about angels and monsters, and that there's some sort of...
Yeah. I mean, I wasn't endorsing endorsing the metaphors being used. The point was that scientists do argue about the unit of selection, and that is what the Dawkins book is about.
A similar probability of creating an angel versus a monster, and there's nothing angel. Okay, even worker ants, even though they appear to be, oh, how nice of them, it's monstrous. They're enslaved.
Yeah, I agree. The point is that it's the worker's own DNA that is doing the manipulating for the DNA's benefit. So if anything, it's even more insidious. More insidious than the slave model.
Okay, I mean, the drone bee is a slave. All right, it takes care of the young, and then and when
and just a point of fact, drone bees are males, so it's the worker bees that look after the young.
And when it gets old, when it's beat up from working so hard, then they throw it out there to go sting somebody and die. I mean, they're completely disposed, completely abused. If that's your definition of an angel, something that's been programmed to be a slave, that's a pretty disgusting example of angelism, right? And I would argue that calling something else an angel, there's just no way to create angels here. That's not what's happening. All right, what's happening is you're creating, slaves to hierarchy. And that's just a fair, and that's...
No, I mean that they're a slave, but they're a slave to their own DNA. But I agree that there's no good story to be found here.
Monstrous in itself, is it not? So how could angelism be the bastard child of monsterism? I mean, it just isn't. You can't call that an angel. I mean, if Frankenstein gave birth to it, it's not a fucking angel.
Yeah, I agree. I guess the point is that from the DNA perspective, the monster angel thing is incidental. If the worker ant DNA got more copies of itself into the future by, I don't know, getting the workers to knit woolly hats for grasshoppers, it will go with that.
It has a monstrous purpose. It exists for a monstrous reason. And even though it looks like something, obviously it's not living a good life, because it's basically been called fodder. It's been basically being turned into a mechanism to be used, to be exploited, for the benefit of an individual's genetic code.
Its own genetic code. To me, if anything, that makes it even more tragic.
Which represents the colony's genetic code. So there is no group selection explicitly, other than the sense that the group code becomes the alpha code. So anyway, so fuck you though for this. You are wrong, and fuck you for indicating that Conferencereport was right in what he said. What he said was absolute motherfucking crap. There's no equal probability, and there's not even an evidence of...
Well, in his defence, I don't think he implied equal probability. I think the point he was making was like the one I made earlier, that the DNA, just cares about getting itself into the future. It doesn't care about how that's achieved.
Planet Earth giving birth to a fucking angel, ever. Show me one. That's what the selfish gene points out, that even symbiotic relationships are just parasitic relationships, where the parasiticism has become in the long-term interest of both parties. So it's exploitation and parasitic.
Yeah, well, nothing to disagree with there. Anyway, sorry, I mean, they were just intended as constructive criticisms, and yeah, I've seen your reply, and I will attempt to reply to that soon. Cheers.